things. I want to let y'all know that we have a leadership team for this group, and it consists of our officers and some other members. And what that team does is we decide what projects and things we want to do during the year. So we meet once a month, first Monday of every month. And if any of you think you would be interested in being on our leadership team, we would be glad to have you. Just talk to me after the meeting about it, and we'll get you set up to come to the next one. The second thing I have to say is we are going to participate in a cleanup at West Point Lake. It's going to be on Saturday, September 28th from 8 to 1. And it's going to be at the Holiday Campground. And if you go to our website page, you'll find out more information about it and a place to RSVP that you're going to come. You do get a free lunch, and if you're a camper, they'll give you a couple days of free participation.
It's the Public Lands Day one.
Yes, it is Public Lands Day, sponsored by the Army Corps of Engineers. And it's really glad to see this turnout tonight. So thanks for coming.
And we probably would have more except the great coinciding our meeting that doesn't always have to be Tuesday. We have another special guest tonight. The director for Georgia Chattahoochee is G. Weber. And we had G come up and certainly cool.
Thank you for being here and not being at the symphony. I guess that seems to be it. My name is G. I am the director for the Georgia chapter Sierra Club. Just so folks, especially the new folks know, there's a national Sierra Club, and then we have state chapters of the Sierra Club, and then we have local groups. So y'all are at a local group meeting. I am the state director, so there's actually multiple local groups here in Georgia. But Middle Chattahoochee, formerly LaGrange, was actually the first local group I ever met. So my first week here at Sierra Club, this is actually the first meeting I ever came to. So it feels good to be at home.
Sure.
So just I want to give you all a little update about what's going on in the chapter. So we have been a staff of 2 people for basically the last 3 years. And we hired a third staff member. Her name is Kathryn Kolb. She started with us in January, and she's our organizer. So basically, she is in charge of getting our staff out into the world, organizing people to take action on environmental issues around the state. And so Taz's first big task was hiring 2 organizers who are starting on Monday. So that's very exciting. So now we have a full organizing team. We're hopefully going to grow it so we can continue to raise money. So we'll be working in communities all around the state to make sure that people are aware of environmental issues going on, giving them ways to get educated about it so they can talk to their neighbors and friends about it, and then obviously telling decision makers, whether it's the governor, whether it's the county commission, what have you, on what they should do when this issue comes up. So that's really exciting. They will probably make their way down here at some point in the new year. So stay tuned for. And then we're hiring a fundraising person, which is exciting for me. And we're in there for that right now. So back to a full staff of 6 people in about 2 weeks, which is good.
Good.
So that's good. We're also doing strategic planning, which y'all hear more about. This is like, it's basically a roadmap for what the chapter is going to be doing over the next 3 years. Hopefully just making more forward progress in Georgia and the political ground shifts under our feet with it. So fingers crossed there. But yeah, the wind is at our back, stays good. So that's just like in general about where the chapter's at. On the issues, it's been an extremely busy year for us. Basically, at the beginning of this year, the Georgia Public Service Commission, which is the body that regulates monopoly utilities in our state, so i.e. Georgia Power, they came to the Georgia Public Service Commission last fall and they said, guys, we actually need more power. Can we have a special process to request more? And so we intervened in that. We got a Sierra Club National Staff Attorneys. Unfortunately, we didn't get the clean energy plans we wanted, but we still have. I'm sure some of y'all have been comments to the Public Service Commission. We have that same process coming up again this year, so you'll be hearing a lot about that in our emails. So, if y'all, I know that this group talks, I think, a lot about clean energy. So if y'all are passionate about clean energy in the new year, I really encourage you to write an email or to write a letter to the Georgia Public Service Commission and tell them why clean energy is. And we will, the organizers will be working on that and give you the tools to do it. So just stay tuned for that. On the Okefenokee, we are still tracking that very closely. Does everyone here know about the Okefenokee issue? Okefenokee is the largest blackwater swamp. It's in Folkston, Georgia, which is just above the Jacksonville area, right on the state line. It's home to endangered species. It's what we call the hidden gem of Georgia. I went there for my 5th grade trip. Like everybody goes there, and they're trying to build a titanium mine, titanium dioxide mine right outside. And so when Trump was president, he changed the rules. So basically, rather than the federal government having authority over the state government. So over this past few years, we've been doing against the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. Hey, don't give this mining company. So go fast forward, it's been 3.5 years. April comes, they start releasing drought permits. And so we were collecting public comments on that, which again, I'm sure some of y'all submitted public comments to decisions about that. And I think we submitted over 4,000 comments. So thank you to everyone in this room to help us do that. We're still waiting to see what they're going to say. Unfortunately, the governor is pretty quiet on the issue. Like he really obviously influences everyone. I believe Dolph Smith. She is, unfortunately, she's kind of our barrier to progress. So we have a lot of bipartisan support for protecting Okefenokee, but still got to move the needle on her. So if you're in the grocery store, talk to her. So that's some other stuff that we've been working on. And then some other things that have been going on. We actually we partnered with Sierra Club National to do a report on energy burden. If you don't know what energy burden is, it's basically how much of your household income goes to paying utilities, power bills. Georgia has some of the highest power bills in the country, and we have some of the highest energy burden in the country, specifically in rural areas, and then specifically in Black households. And that's actually what the research was about is there a correlation between Black households and energy burden? And basically we found that yes, as a community is basically has a heavier African American population, their energy burden, which is an environmental justice issue. So we've been doing a lot of organizing, telling people in communities, do you know what energy burden is? How you can reduce your bill, maybe it's putting weather strips on the windows. So doing some of that. And same thing, our organizers will be working around the state to educate people on energy burden. That way, they can go to people like Georgia Power or the Georgia Public Service Commission and say, hey, your phone contribution should be higher than the environment, right? So that's something that we've been kind of doing over the summer. We've been doing a lot of that in partnership with Science for Georgia. They're a really great organization. And then we have Georgia One, which is up in Odessa, New York. So that's really exciting. Now we are in election season. So it's I'm not gonna lie, y'all. I was doing that for 3 months ago. Harris is now at the top of the ticket in Georgia to basically play again, which means we are doing political activity in the chapter. So if any of y'all are interested in sending some text messages and encouraging voters to get out and vote, and vote for someone who's going to be much better on the environment than her opponent, I encourage you to do that. We are also working 2 transit expansion votes in Gwinnett County and Cobb. Y'all know how rapid traffic is there. It's basically a proposal to expand bus rapid transit in basically government. It's literally like someone comes to your house just like an Uber would, but it's paid for. So that's interesting. So we're working on that this November. We're endorsing candidates right now in some of these key House and Senate races at the local level, and then we will hopefully hear election results maybe not a month later, maybe a few days later. And then depending on what happens with the election, what I tell people, I know neither of the candidates are perfect all the time, but in this job, the president matters and their administration matters so much. I cannot tell, I was just on a call today, I just told you about pollution on water rule change. I was on another call today about an EPA rule change that is much better than what this administration would have done. So I always tell my friends who are like, they're not this, they're not that, I'm like, yeah, but this matters so much, especially when it comes to environmental policies. So it's really important that you tell your neighbors why it's important to you as an environmentalist to get out and vote, why you're supporting someone, and also just, democracy is really important and having free and fair elections. So we're working on that. And then really we're moving right into legislative session now up in the Grand Rapids County. So we want a staff member who is actually going to be running our citizen lobbying program, which is really important for this group because we gotta love Lynn Smith a lot, right? And so what we'll do is we will train you on how to talk to your representatives about whatever issue is important to you. So we'll have conservation issues come up, like about Okeechobee, we'll have clean energy issues come up. Unfortunately, we're getting all these federal funds to do stuff like putting solar in operations, for example. But Georgia unfortunately doesn't have the best landscape for doing that. It kind of makes it difficult, so we're trying to change those laws so we can use that money that we've been granted from the federal. And then basically we're moving into that IRP process down to Georgia Public Service Commission, and that'll go all the way until June. So really like the next 7 months, we pretty much know what our is. So if any of those things are interested to y'all, please let me know. You obviously have your local group here, but we're always, if you want to get involved in the chapter level, please let me know. I also have a grant proposal to hire a holidays coordinator. So we can host more statewide holidays. So y'all will be hearing about that if the funding is through. Cross your fingers for me. But yeah, it's really good. The wind is at our backs. I'm hoping the political environment doesn't change too much over the next 3 months. That's really what I'm praying for every night, because it will make our work here in Georgia, where unfortunately our political leaders don't love me as much as those this room do. Not all of them, but just love them. But with that, I can take a few questions if anyone has any specific questions. Or you can catch me afterwards. Yeah.
You know that Lynn Smith has an opponent.
Yes, and we are endorsing, we're trying to endorse that race, right?
Come talk to me because I work on her campaign. Her
Okay,
name is Diane Boulay. She's a Democrat.
okay,
A mental health services facilitator and just a lovely, lovely woman.
okay, yeah, let's chat. So Sierra Club also, as you all know, we endorse candidates. And so what they'll do is they'll put our emblem on the banners and when they're sending out, putting things on social media, so if we, give her, yeah, that's someone we definitely, so let's talk. Anyone else? Okay, well, come catch me afterwards. Thank you all so much for doing what you do and for being a part of the environmental movement here in Georgia. I know sometimes it feels sticky and hard, especially with politics, but the fact that y'all come here, meeting after meeting and show up is really important. And hopefully we can keep a good work going. So thank y'all so much for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Yep.
We should do it certain today, you're juggling. I live with my human being to make sure everybody's signed, yes.
Signed machines.
Ellen is also our membership coordinator, so if you're not a member, please see her. What's the name, $15?
$15, yes, I've got memberships here, yes. So it's got $15 a pay.
Sierra 19.
This is one of the kiosks that this little travel bag, nice little travel bag. You see,
I think that's Portugal, yeah. But take it easy from her. Great. And Laura is our Halloween director, we have anything installed?
We will.
We will.
I need to get research on the first aid, but October we will have.
Great.
It'll be hiking or biking.
Good. Okay, our program tonight is with Kathryn Kolb, and that was a couple of years ago, she came down to take us for a walk through the Deason's property. Ted and Ann Deason, if you take the first exit off of 85, Malacca Parkway, across from the walk. like when we call the line, this is where the trees and like I'm sure the started out the beginning of the European settlement. So, Kathryn's from Atlanta with a group called EcoAddendum, and she's broadcasting to us from Virginia, I believe.
Yep,
Okay, the magic of technology.
yep.
So, enjoy. Thanks, Kathryn.
Okay, hello, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, I can sort of hear you. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen and start this show. Let's see how we can do this. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Okay, does that look like the beginning of a slideshow to you guys?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Well, let me just introduce myself right quick. I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization based in Atlanta called EcoAddendum. We call ourselves EcoA for short. We do a whole lot of educational work. Our program's expanded a great deal in the last few years, but we do lots of walks and outings, stewardship programs, restoration consulting and programs throughout Metro Atlanta and beyond. So this is a slideshow that applies a lot to Metro Atlanta, but it really applies to the whole Georgia Piedmont and our entire area here. So first of all, you know, the X here is the city of Atlanta, but this map shows the cessions that the Muskogee Creek and then the Cherokee made throughout the kind of early settlement history. The area where city of Atlanta is today was ceded to the American government, the state of Georgia, in 1821. And I think your area is even a little bit later, 1825. And up around where the Cherokee were, it would have been a little bit later, even so. This is really a very clear illustration of how recent our landscape was altered by European style settlement. As a point of comparison, our area was settled about 200 years after Harvard University was founded. So get a little bit of a perspective on that. We really built out very, very late in our area. On the western part of Georgia, of course, the eastern part was settled earlier. And the other thing we need to remember is we are living in the new world, not the old world, where our cities and our landscape doesn't have, you know, 13,000 years or 7,000 or 8,000 years of almost urban settlements, where many of our older world cities have that sort of that very long underpinning of human disturbance when we talk about the natural systems. So today's landscape in our area, we can really kind of call it a patchwork quilt. Sometimes we have on the top, these are also from Metro Atlanta. The top is original old growth forest that we have left. We also have at the bottom areas that might have been disturbed. They might have been graded in the 1970s, and they may have trees and other kinds of foliage, but it's actually a fairly disturbed landscape, and we have a lot of invasive species. This is kind of what our patchwork quilt looks like. There's a great website called historicaerials.com. And what you see here when they first started doing aerial photographs is probably in the 1930s. And so you can see what the landscape looked like in that time. In our region, a lot of times we had farms, a lot of times we had terraced farms, but there are every farm had a pocket of woodlands called a woodlot, where you cut trees that might have been used for your cabin, might have been used for firewood, might have been used for making barrels or tool handles. And so a lot of those little pockets and woodlots actually continue to hold some of the remnants of that original forest. And the places that we find this more likely are going to be places that people didn't want to farm, and then later places where people didn't want to develop. And so those are going to be steep slopes, narrow stream corridors, rocky places, historic properties, and then we can tell that we have some of these high value areas by our indicator species. The photo here is also Metro Atlanta, but it's there's a lot of boulders even though it's kind of a floodplain, it's kind of a rocky substrate over on the west side of Atlanta. And you can see there's a whole field of mayapple, which is one of our indicator species that tells us we've got old growth forest remnants. How do we tell that we have old growth forest remnants? You may find these in a park. They may even be in your backyard. In our area, kind of in Georgia, west of the Ocmulgee, we have a much more recently built out landscape. So you may have little pockets and remnants of that old growth forest in your neighborhood or, on your property. You may not realize it. So how can we tell? So what we want to do is the first thing, kind of stands to reason. Our area wants to be a forest. It is a deciduous hardwood forest for the most part. And so when we look for large girth trees, doesn't necessarily matter how broad the tree span is, but when they have large girth, that's kind of telling us they're older. But particularly a way to tell this is we have slow growing species. If you get to know your species of trees, you'll know that some of our oaks, beeches, black gums are very slow growing trees. So when we see really large girth, particularly of those trees, you're looking at an older forest remnant. Tulip poplar, sweet gum, maybe sugarberry, some of those faster growing trees, they're large. Water oaks is an example of that, but it's not really going to tell us we have an older forest. If you see a black gum this size, you are looking at an old growth forest remnant. And this is actually a tree photographed on the Beeson's property. The girth of this is telling us, if we do a little bit of math, and we can't know because we can't count the rings because we can't really look inside that tree, but we are guessing, well, conservatively, that these trees are probably 400 years old. And the Beeson's property fits into one of those categories. It's an older property. It's only had a couple of owners since it was handed over from Native Americans. And so black gum actually is a tree that wasn't valued in the 19th century to cut for timber. And so we have an older property. The family didn't convert this particular part of their property. Many folks in Georgia, at some point converted their property to plow, putting a plow on the farm, doing farming, or then later in the 20th century that went to pine plantations. And if you didn't do that, then you may have a little pocket, well, if you see some of these older trees, of that original older forest. A lot of times we'll find these trees we call sort of hiding in plain sight. This is actually in Metro Atlanta, just a couple of blocks from my house. This is in the back part of somebody's yard. If you see that tree, it's got kind of an orange X on it. It's covered with English ivy. Doesn't look very special. It's not even very big. It's about 30 inches DBH, diameter, I should say, 30 inches diameter. They cut this tree down, and I actually got a wedge from it, from the developer. It turns out I counted the rings. It's a 280-year-old tree right in somebody's backyard. People drive by that all the time. That's not, Civil War. 280 years old is before Thomas Jefferson was born. So we've got some old trees and little pockets right around us. We just kind of aren't as aware of it. Here's another tree that was cut down again in my neighborhood. I'm, in Metro Atlanta, actually in the city of Atlanta. This tree was about 24 inches. It was a white oak, another slow growing species, 24 inches in diameter at about 10 feet up, and it's 180 years old. Again, very unnoticed right in somebody's yard. So another way we can tell that we have old growth forest remnants, this is actually a park, is what we call relic trees. So if you look at the growth form, this photo, we have some kind of tall, straight trees kind of growing up to meet the canopy in the foreground. But if you look in the background, we've got this tree has it has some horizontal branches that maybe died out, and then it's got a very horizontal growth form. So what that tells us is this tree spent a good bit of its time out in the open where there weren't other trees around it. If you get close to the tree, it has a very, very large base. It's a slow growing species, white oak. So when we see this, we're looking at a relic tree. It's telling us that this tree was probably not cut in the first wave of cutting. It's probably old growth going back to the original forest before any of the trees were cut. They cut a lot of trees around it. And now that the forest is coming back, that tree is kind of closing down, self-pruning its lower branches and growing much more vertically. But we can tell because of this type of growth form that it is an old growth tree. Another way we can tell some of our old growth remnants is when we have these kinds of combinations of not very common trees. When we start to see black gum, scarlet oak, black oak, white or chestnut oak, sometimes it's rare but can still be found. When we start to see our native umbrella and big leaf magnolias, when we start to see a fair amount of the hornbeams, particularly hop hornbeam, native hazelnuts, pawpaw. These are some of the species that when we start to see a lot of these on a property together, it's giving us some high tree biodiversity. That's another indicator that we've got an old growth forest remnant. This is actually a large beech tree. It has a very broad canopy. Again, it's another relic tree. Some of the reasons why they might have left and not cut a tree like this is because mass trees, which are trees that are producing a lot of acorns and beech nuts and so forth, were highly valued by those early farmers because that was free food for livestock. So we didn't have stock laws until 1895. Before 1895, you were required, if you were a planter, to actually fence in your crops. And it was not the fault of someone who maybe owned herds of pigs or cattle. It was your responsibility to fence in your crops. But then that changed in 1895. And so stock laws then changed the whole landscape, where then you suddenly had to fence in your livestock. But a lot of these trees that were left back in the 1800s and stuff would have been producing free food for livestock. So when we have this is also this is an older white oak, probably again in the 200-year-old range. It's in a neighborhood right next to a house. Someone's built a garage, but that tree is probably about 200 years old. We can tell by that girth and because it's a slow growing species. And so we actually did a little soil test. This is actually a soil test. Usually in a developed area, you hit red clay at about 2 or 3 inches. This is 14 inches of loamy old growth soil, because if you have a 200-year-old tree, you're going to have 200-year-old soil. So even though someone has built next to this is an older neighborhood, the landscape hasn't been graded. And if your landscape hasn't been graded, then those species can not only do well in those older soils, but that's also a key where we can find indicator species where we might still have some seed beds left. That's going to be a little bit more in a natural area than in a lawn, but we've got old growth soils here. So once you grade and you take those soils away, you're really going to have a hard time kind of getting that native forest back. Our red clays are kind of the disintegration of the rocks that are forming the Appalachians and so forth. And so a lot of those are aluminosilicate minerals. And so we have a lot of aluminum in these clays, and aluminum is actually toxic to trees and plants. So if we want to maintain not only our original species, but have nice soils for our new plantings, we kind of want to limit that grading. So another way that we can find another indicator of old growth forest, what we call indicator species. And so these are species where the seeds aren't traveling, or maybe they're here for some other reasons. I've got two images here. If you guys are familiar with plants, you'll notice a leaf of wild ginger. I call it wild ginger. It's actually heartleaf. It's the hexastylus. It's not related to the ginger you buy in the store. It's not the Asarum wild ginger, which you find up in the mountains. But this is a little plant where the seeds are really not traveling. A lot of times you'll have plants where, birds may eat the seeds and carry them a few counties over, or you may have seeds that have little burrs and stickers and they stick on your dog or your pant leg or a deer or something. Or you may have seeds with little wings that are blowing in the wind. So these are all seeds that are traveling. They're kind of getting around to germinate. But there's lots of plants, smaller plants, we call them, many of them spring ephemerals. If you guys are familiar with like bloodroot, trillium, those kind of species, those seeds are not traveling. So we call them indicator species, because if you find them on the forest floor, they didn't come here from somewhere else. They've been in those older, old growth forest soils for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They are literally the living legacy of that older forest. And so they indicate that you've got that higher value forest. Even if some timber has been taken, those soils still hold those older seed beds. They can regenerate that native forest. On the right is a pink lady slipper, and that's one of our native orchids. And they're also an indicator species, but for a different reason. The seeds are very small, almost like dust, and they get blown around in the wind, but they can't germinate unless they have a partner fungi. Every orchid species has a partner fungi. And so that way we know that they're hitting rich older soils that have a lot of fungi. So they can actually, there's a number of species that we call kind of soft indicators, where the seeds may travel, but the plant can only do well if it's in partnership, maybe with some of these microorganisms in older, richer soils. And some of these are a list of, when you start to see some of these plants on the forest floor, you're probably looking at an old growth forest remnant. Solomon's plume, the trilliums, bloodroot, spotted wintergreen, black cohosh, doll's eyes, some of our native orchids. Horsebalm, the collinsonias also are a good indicator. The toothworts are a good indicator, wild geranium. There's a number of these. Hepatica is another really good one. So this is actually this is one of our native orchids, rattlesnake plantain. That's a little rarer. A lot of times we see maybe cranefly orchid, a little more common. And this one is more rare, probably because it can only partner with maybe one or two species of fungi, where some of those other orchids may have other species they can work with. So even though our southeastern forests were pretty much timbered between 1870 and 1920, these are areas in North Georgia that might be recovering high biodiversity because their soils were relatively undisturbed. We really want to emphasize how important it is to maintain these older soils. So if you have, or, you know, maybe in your neighborhood or your neighborhood park, or even on your property or in your yard, if you have, you know, an area that you'd like to restore for native biodiversity, you know, we want to go about that the right way. The first thing we want to do is identify the underlying native landscape. You know, we have certain native species that are going to thrive in certain areas, not necessarily other ones. Even the difference between a north-facing or a south-facing slope, whether you're in a floodplain, whether you're on a hilltop. If you notice, when you walk or hike in these areas, you'll notice that there are certain species that are really happy in certain ecosystem niches. So what we want to do is be able to identify those, you know, on your property. Here's an example, another example where we want to be able to read that forest, because even if you have a lot of invasive species, you may have high value natives there and they might not be visible in all seasons. But you can also tell, you know, of course, by the trees and things like that we just talked about. So here's an example. If you look at this photo, we can see a really nice wild ginger leaf, but it's surrounded, it's got liriope and English ivy and some vinca. So this is the kind of thing where if you're walking through your yard or park and you notice this, you can say, aha, even though I see some invasives in here, I know that I've probably got a latent old growth forest soils and things like that. So when we're working in areas like this, we want to be very careful. We don't want to go in there with a bunch of broadcast spray. We don't want to rip all this stuff out of the ground without really considering what's going to be going on in different seasons. So kind of our rule of thumb, just as in medicine, if we want to heal a landscape, we want to first do no harm. So when we're talking about restoring native landscapes, it's a lot of people kind of get involved in, it's like we got to kill the invasives, right? It becomes kind of like a battle about invasives. But it really isn't about killing invasives. We do need to do that, but it's about restoring that native landscape. And what we found, we've been doing this for lots of years, and we do a lot of work with volunteers, and we have a lot of experience. And these are some of the things that we've learned. Chemical sprays are almost never needed. Sometimes we do a little cut and treat, which means we cut a privet stem or Eleagnus or kudzu or something like that. We might treat that stem literally with a few drops, sometimes of glyphosate. We're actually developing some natural treatments, so maybe we don't even have to use that, but we never have to use any kind of spray. And a lot of times people maybe want to take goats out there. We have to keep careful about goats and sheep, because goats and sheep are going to eat everything. And they may really actually set you back in terms of your native biodiversity. Another thing about goats, they're going to eat all the English ivy and they're going to eat the kudzu, but they don't eat the roots. So those plants are just going to come right back. You can't do goats alone. Unless if you have goats, eat in the same location for many years in a row, yes, eventually some of those plants will stop putting out leaves, but you've also pretty much killed your entire understory. Goats will actually basically pull over small native trees and kill them. So we want to be careful. If you have an area that you really don't have anything of value, you don't have native species, goats might be appropriate. Some invasive species actually have some significant habitat benefits. Porcelain berry is, a vine that can climb up and grow over things, but it also puts out a ton of flowers that are just mobbed by native pollinators. So we want to be careful in every green space where we are. We may not want to take out all those invasives at once, and maybe not until we've planted some replacements, so that we'll have something for pollinators if we take out that porcelain berry. We also want to remove invasives in stages, and we want to replant in stages. If we go and wipe out a whole floodplain full of privet, which is where all the birds were nesting and that was their food source, and we don't replace it with anything, we've really kind of done some damage to that habitat. And we also maybe can't hold it. If you take out an acre of privet, who's going to be there to maintain that it doesn't come back? What you want to do is maybe take out a patch of privet, replant with some elderberry, something like that in a floodplain, and then, gradually do that over time. That's less disruptive to the native birds and other species that are working there or living there. And then we can kind of take in stages. So we want to study our landscape before we do a lot of restoration. We want to, when we do work on restoration, we want to take out the fastest and most damaging invasive first. Those will be our tier 1 and tier 2 invasives. This is actually a photograph of what wisteria can do when it gets away from you. Very, very damaging. Kudzu, English ivy, of course, Eleagnus, Japanese chafflower in the metro area is really bad. And privet, I would say privet is kind of tier 2, but kudzu, wisteria, and liriope, those are all tier 1 species. And then when we go to, here's one of our volunteers digging out kudzu roots. It's a lot more effective than spray, and once you dig out that root, it isn't coming back. When you spray it, it's probably going to continue to come back. So anyway, kudzu isn't the worst thing out there. It's doable. One thing that we see a lot is people are cutting vines off of trees. We want to cut that English ivy. We want to cut the wisteria and so forth. But we find that when people don't know their species, they're cutting a lot of native vines. And that can be really harmful to our ecosystem. So this is an example. This is actually over in Murphy-Candler Park. Someone has cut a native trumpet vine, and that's what's producing all those orange flowers that hummingbirds are coming to. And so we have lots of other native vines. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell them apart, but poison ivy, actually it's our friend, and greenbrier, also some high value vines. Does anybody take a guess of what flowers these are? Not hearing anybody out there. So these are actually poison ivy flowers. You don't get to see those very often. Poison ivy produces really high value berries for birds and other wildlife. Most berries are sugars and carbohydrates, but poison ivy berries are very high in protein. So we want to try and even our, if we're going to have to walk through it to get to your car, you don't want to leave it there. But when we do restoration, we really want to leave those native vines. You can see by this photo that we have some English ivy, we got some Virginia creeper, which also puts out a whole lot of berries for wildlife. And then we have climbing wild hydrangea, another high value native vine. They're all going to look a bit the same, particularly in the winter. So when we do this restoration, we want to make sure we're not losing our higher value natives. Here's an example of greenbrier. Greenbrier produces a whole lot of berries at the end of the season when they get a little sun. They also grow in tangles. Again, not something you want to have to walk through to get to your car, but in the back part of your yard or somewhere in your property, you kind of want to leave those greenbrier tangles because they're great nesting places for birds. And deer love to eat greenbrier. And in fact, greenbrier shoots are edible for people. It's actually one of those things that you pick that actually taste pretty good. It's not just edible, it's actually kind of tasty. So, you know, when we talk about restoration after we get rid of invasives, you know, where do we want to plant? What do we want to plant? Why are we planting stuff? We really want to do an assessment of the property first. Do you really need more native plants, or do you just need to have the invasives removed? If you have an older forest remnant, you may have a latent seed bed and you take some of that English ivy off of there. It's probably good to even wait a year to see what nature is going to bring back naturally before we start planting things. And just as a general rule, forested areas usually are missing some shrubs and forbs, which is, you know, wildflowers and stuff. We really don't need to plant more trees in most of our forested areas. We've got tons and tons of trees, but we're really kind of missing that shrub layer, some of those other plants, native plants. When we see, I can't really see that. I see that slide. One of the things is in North Georgia, we had a lot of actually, sorry, I think I'm skipping a slide. In any case, what we want to do is study our landscape before we make management decisions. Just kind of get to know our landscape a little bit. So if you're looking at your own, forest or your own property or a park or something, you know, take a look at your landscape. Does it look like this, right? We've got really old beech trees. These are really slow growing. There's a lot of English ivy on the ground, but this is 100% an old growth forest remnants. That tree that we're looking at right there, again, is probably over 200 years old. So we might take a different approach to this landscape than we would have to this landscape. This landscape might have been, you know, row crops for 50 years. Now it's a lawn, and we have a few trees on the edge, but the soils here may not be able to support some of those forest plants that we can get them at a native plant nursery, but they might not do well here. You know, kind of a rule of thumb is if we're starting to do restoration is to start with common, easy to grow species because you know they're going to be successful. These are some species here. One of these is very common, just about any roadside, you'll find it. One of the it's one of the bone sets, along with some of the other eupatoriums. Those are going to be great for pollinators. They're really easy to propagate. You'll probably get them for free if you just stop, you know, mowing in a certain area. So let's make use of a lot of these common things that have a high benefit to the ecosystem. Don't have to kind of start trying to work with rarer plants. This is actually an old growth remnant that it has some rare plants. We want to kind of see what's already there and then start to build a broader native biodiversity over time. If you may recognize this, carrion flower is an old growth forest remnant. So even though we've got, you know, we're in a park, we're in an urban area, we've got some English ivy on the ground, but this old growth forest indicator tells us we've got really high value soils. So if we do get that English ivy off the ground, we might be able to plant some of those native species here and know that they would do well. Here's a couple of native ground covers, partridge berry and some of the potentilla groups, the cinquefoils. Those are some alternatives. Partridge berry is going to be pretty slow growing and you may need some older soils, and that's going to be better in shade. And the other is going to do better in sun, but there's lots of great ground covers we can use that aren't non-natives. One thing that we kind of forget about is a lot of the original meadow areas were probably associated with beaver managed wetlands. We have back in the day, we kind of eradicated the beaver. They're starting to come back, but the beavers were responsible for creating meadows. They would flood some areas. A lot of those trees would open up. The trees that were in the flood area might die, but that's producing a whole lot of habitat and open area for a lot of our moisture-loving wildflowers that need some sun. Those are the rarest and most endangered in our ecosystem. Some jewelweed here is an example of that. If we're planting trees, a lot of times, you know, the best way to plant a tree that's going to become healthy is to actually plant the acorns. But we do want to kind of focus on our native trees, not necessarily planting non-native trees. In our ecosystem, a lot of times you will get native trees to just regenerate naturally, and you won't even have to plant them. Here's an example. This is actually from my yard. The tree on the right is a white oak, really high value, great tree to plant, but it was a planted tree, and it was added to, you know, soils. It probably came from a nursery, and it sort of didn't know where it was, and it takes a lot of time for it to readjust. Whereas the tree on the left is a naturally occurring winged elm that popped up probably, you know, 3 or 4 years, maybe even 5 or 7 years after the white oak was planted. So we really want to respect the trees that have already got a great start. And if we have an open area, you kind of want to add trees, but if we have a forest, we probably don't need to add them. Here's just an example of some of the work that we do with volunteers. This is in the city of Brookhaven, a little bit north of Atlanta. We worked with volunteers. Here's a kind of a forest area. This is an old growth forest remnant, tons of English ivy off the ground. We work with volunteers all the time. These were actually untrained. You know, a lot of these folks were in high school, but we have a stewardship program. So we had maybe 40 people out there, but we had about 8 stewards that were all helping them do exactly what we needed to do very carefully, not damaging the old growth forest underneath. And you can get rid of a lot of English ivy with volunteers, and you can do it well, you can do it carefully. Don't have to use goats, you don't have to use spray, and we can get the job done. So just as, you know, kind of just as our body is constantly working to heal itself, so is our natural ecosystem. And we can probably help that ecosystem recover best when we take the time to really study it, take the time to look, listen, and learn from nature in learning how to help nature restore itself. So that is my talk for the evening. I see a few people that are still moving around in there, but we are EcoAddendum. We do naturalist walks, stewardship trainings. I do a lot of eco restoration consulting. That can be for yards, that can be for parks and green spaces. This is my contact information and the contact information for EcoAddendum. That's my phone number, and you're welcome to call me anytime, continue the dialogue, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
We have questions from me while I'm going to the computer or relay or something.
Hey, Kathryn,
Yes?
are you planning on coming to this property anytime?
I'm having a very hard time hearing you.
Okay, I'll get up here. Are you planning on coming back to the Beeson's property anytime?
I'd love to. I probably, we have to talk with them about that. But I think a great time, well, there's, you know, late fall would be lovely because we'll have some nice fall color. But then, you know, probably early spring, there's a lot of indicator species and spring ephemerals on their property. We can chat with them and see kind of what they might think, but I'd be happy to come out there. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Anne wanted to be here tonight, but she had another obligation.
Sure.
Remind me, the oldest black gums over there, how far back do they go?
Well, you know, it's a little bit of a guesstimate, but we're guessing probably in the 400s.
Okay.
They're well over 300. You just don't see black gums like that. They're just
Yeah.
never seen. In fact, it's really interesting, you know, if you go to buy a black gum, then the tree nursery industry considers black gum a mid-story species. That's how you'll see it listed. The reason they call it that is because it literally takes 200 years to reach the canopy.
Wow.
It's a canopy tree, but it's just very, very slow growing.
Okay, Laura has a question. She's coming up.
Kathryn, my husband and I have bought some land, that we've noticed it's all got a lot of the old growth characteristics you're talking about,
Right.
with the herbs and the trees, wildflowers. One of the problems is that we do not have many shrubs, and I'm wondering, we have apparently lots of deer. I think that's part of why we don't have much of a shrub layer.
Yeah. Well, it kind of depends a little bit on the ecosystem and what would have been there. It's a little hard to say. Our native forest in the Georgia Piedmont will have some shrubs. In a forested area with a full canopy, there isn't going to be a lot. Sweet shrub is one of the things we find there. It kind of depends. That's going to be on more of like a slope. If you have more of a floodplain area, that might be a little bit different. There usually will be sub shrubs, you know, maybe like, you know, native hydrangea, things like that. If you do have a deer population, deer are taking a real toll on biodiversity. So it's possible that they're eating it. You should be seeing some hearts of buston, also called strawberry bush. That's the native euonymus. You should be seeing some of that. It won't be a thick shrub layer, but there's a fair amount of shrubs that ought to be there. But you know, we really have to kind of walk the property and kind of see exactly what ecosystem niche that you have. And then you might be able to reintroduce some shrubs as well. Depending again on your landscape, underlying landscape.
Hey, Catherine, thank you. So I have a question. So is there any state or local laws about like trees that you can or cannot cut down, or and that can be in Georgia, or do you know of other states and municipalities? Like, is there ways to protect these trees, you know, legislatively? Thanks.
So actually, I do a lot of work on tree ordinances. I'm doing that work for City of Atlanta and also for DeKalb County. Essentially in the state of Georgia, there's because we have home rule in the state of Georgia, you can, as a municipality, you can make laws that are stricter, but not less lenient than state law. So take stream buffers for an example. State law says you have to have a 25-foot stream buffer. So municipalities have started to say, well, we think it would be better if we had a 75-foot stream buffer. They can do that, but they can't say that you can only have a 10-foot stream buffer, right? So municipalities have created tree ordinances. The state has no, you can cut any tree for any reason. There's just no limitation on cutting trees at all until you get to the municipal level. So that's going to be a city or a county government. And a lot of people, particularly in fast growing urban areas, have been alarmed at loss of trees. So there's starting to be some tree ordinances. City of Atlanta has a tree ordinance, City of Brookhaven, DeKalb County, Alpharetta, lots of the metro area. I don't know if LaGrange has one or not, but there's a lot of municipalities that have tree ordinances, and that's where you're gonna, that's the legal mechanism to get protection in your community. Now, you may be able to have some sort of historic, if you have a historic property or a historic neighborhood, you may be able to have some sort of limitation on cutting certain kind of trees because it's been designated a historic area, but that has gonna have to be registered as historic. So that's pretty much the only routes that I know of to have tree protection, and it's pretty difficult to do that. So there's a lot of folks that want to be able to cut any tree anywhere, anytime. And we have to kind of come up with a balance. So I've been doing a lot of work on that, trying to come up with a balance. If anyone wants to talk with me in more in depth about tree ordinances, I'd be happy to do it. Just, you know, let me know. I'll be happy to talk more about that.
Kathryn, there's a Zoom question that I'm gonna have to read. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. How do you take into account successional processes when conducting restoration in old growth fragments?
That's a really interesting question. And the first thing that pops into my mind is pines. Because there are very few now down in LaGrange. I still don't think we've got longleaf down there, but in our ecosystem in the Georgia Piedmont, we have a whole lot of loblolly pine. And loblolly pine in our ecosystem really comes up as a sort of a result of disturbance. So we have a ton of pines. If you have, a yard or a park that's just mostly loblolly pine, two things have occurred. Either it was primarily a pine plantation. Loblolly pine is our kind of upstart pine. It grows quickly in a disturbance naturally. So the timber industry picked it up because it grows really fast. So we have a lot of human disturbance on the landscape. So that's giving us a lot of pines. If you do a damage to the ecosystem, pines are kind of come up quickly. There'll be a lot of them, and then they kind of give way at the maybe 80 to 100-year mark, and you'll start to see the hardwoods come in. So a lot of times we'll be on a landscape where the pines are kind of self-editing and they're dying out, or maybe we're starting to see some pine beetles, right? So that's a natural process where the pines are going to give way and the hardwoods are going to come in. And that's totally normal. I would not worry about, for instance, pines sort of dying out. It depends what you're in most of the Georgia Piedmont, and there may be some niche ecosystems that are different, but in most of the Georgia Piedmont, our mature forest, our apex forest that you're kind of aiming for, that old growth forest, is going to be based in hardwoods. And up on the higher ridges, it's going to be oaks and hickories. And when you get down into the floodplains, you're going to have, sweet gum, sycamore, sugarberry, water oak, things like that. But it's going to be hardwoods. And so if you're seeing a whole lot of pine, that's not some kind of little long leaf is different, that behaves differently, and that does create stands that are old growth. But mostly it's going to be hardwoods. And so you can sort of see where your forest is going. Most of the time in our area, you have an area that's been impacted. It's been timbered. It was maybe farmed. It was a pasture. It's starting to grow back up in trees. Most of the time, you have a native tree base that you can work with. We don't have a whole lot of invasive trees here. So a lot of times there are a few that you may need to take out, but most of the time we have native trees, and you just want to allow that process to continue. Usually what we see in our ecosystem is the shrub layer and the ground layer has been more disturbed, and you actually need to take more care to restore that. I'm not sure if I answered that question exactly how you needed that answered. Is that close, or do I still need to clarify something?
I don't have any other comments yet.
Okay.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Anybody else have a question? Okay, well, thanks so much, Kathryn, for zooming in to us. And
Sure.
yeah, I'll have Ann give you a shout and see if you guys could arrange another tour through their forest.
Okay, that sounds great. I'd love to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I apologize for not being there in person. I've had some kind of family stuff going on, and I just kind of needed to be up here. So anyway, I'm glad that it worked out, though. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I'm glad that we have Zoomability.
Yes, that really does make it good. Well,
Yeah.
thank you guys so much, and I'm happy to continue the dialogue or take any other questions that you have. And yeah, love to. Let's go ahead and try and plan something else with the Beesons. That would be fun.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And speaking of Zoom, our next meeting is also going to be Zoom. It's the fellow from Columbia, South Carolina, that has photographed raptors. He's come with the book called Raptor Quest. Maybe let me know that. But yeah, he's going to join us. And if you guys from out of town can't make it back on the break, you can sign up online to Zoom at the comfort of your own home. We're on Facebook, we're on Meetup, and Yeah, I think that does it. I won't see you next month. I'm gonna be in Eastern Europe. So I will, see you after the election. Let's make it a good. Totally understand. Anyway, thanks for joining.